And now we're going to have a mini session on education. And as you know, education has been one of the major tracks in the last 3 days of our sessions on a more perfect union. Education is one of the sectors most disrupted by the pandemic. My next guest, Randi Weingarten, is president of the 1.7 million member American Federation of Teachers. As you can imagine, her organization has been especially busy during this pandemic, and it's always busy. Randi, thanks so much for joining us. Look, I want to start with the news of the day. The Build Back Better plan looks like it got some scaffolding and framing. There's still a lot of skirmishes. Yep. We don't know how it'll all come in. But one of the planks of it is universal pre-K paid for. I'm interested in how big a deal that is. What's the context for it? And what are you happy about the bill? What are you unhappy about the bill? I mean, I know, and I know we're not there yet, but just, at this point in the game.
So let's just say that these two bills have to be taken together. One is a more traditional bricks and mortar infrastructure bill that, frankly, moderates, Republicans and Democrats have said that they've been for infrastructure forever, and Trump couldn't get it done. And you had 60 some odd votes, 68 votes in the Senate for it. And that goes from repairing bridges and roads to getting lead out of the water and getting internet and wiring to rural areas that don't have it. So that bill is sitting there, and that's a big jobs bill. And now this second bill, it kind of takes in many of the others, not all of the others, but many other foundations for a new economy, one being education. We know through brain research that when you can actually educate 3 and 4 and 5-year-olds and give them pre-K and give them 3K, you're going to give them a healthier start in life, because that's when our brains are so supple. And this then says, let's do that for all kids, not just for rich or middle class kids. Childcare, so that families are not paying more than 7% of their income for childcare. We saw this in the pandemic, that when schools and other things were closed, how do frontline workers actually go to work in person? We need to make sure that childcare is affordable. We also need to make sure that elder care is affordable, and that's part of this bill too. We also need to make sure that climate is actually that 1 out of every 3 people in America have gone through a climate changing situation this summer, from the floods and the hurricanes in Louisiana and Florida and Texas, to the fires in California, to the fast floods in New York and New Jersey, which killed people. We have to be serious about changing the climate. And all of these things create jobs and help create better jobs and help give people a better way through or to the American dream and the middle class. So are there things that didn't get in there? Yeah. Are there things that we will fight for another day for, like parental leave? Yes, of course. But if you take these two bills together, it is a transformation like the transformation in the 60s that JFK, that Lyndon Johnson did, first JFK, but then Lyndon Johnson in terms of Medicare and Medicaid and Title I, and the changes that FDR did about Social Security. It is about shifting the economy so that regular folks have a shot at their American dream, paid for by people who have done really, really, really well in the last few years, because the economy is very, very lopsided right now.
So you sound hopeful, and I want to ask a question. I'm so irritated right now that Facebook has renamed itself Meta, because I want to ask you a Meta question. I don't want Facebook to get any credit for my Meta question on this, but you sound hopeful. But one of the issues that I want to ask you in kind of a big frame, and I want to get your thoughts on, schools reopening, the civic dimension of that, building citizens of the future as we think about a more perfect union, but also voting? I mean, I'm interested in solvency of democracy as you see it. You just said you're hopeful about what we just did, but when it comes to the solvency of democracy as we look forward, what are the wobbly parts of that you think we still have to shore up?
I am very concerned, and I don't care what Facebook renames itself. I am very concerned about what has happened in terms of our democracy these last few years and in terms of what's going on in schools right now as a result of that. Just look at Facebook's algorithms. Facebook's algorithms to get the clicks, to get so for them to make more money, they have to make people more angry. And the more angry people get, the more uncertain people are, particularly in the midst of still dealing with COVID, the more toxic it is. And so if you take the misinformation and disinformation, there is no such thing as a false fact. Either it is a fact or it isn't a fact, or an alternative fact. You take the misinformation and disinformation and you brew it with this kind of anxiety and agita that people have. Mm-hmm. We have a very fragile situation, and you see it in terms of what's happening in our democracy. Our democracy, and look, I'm a social studies teacher. Our democracy is built on a piece of freaking paper, the Constitution of the United States of America. It requires the goodwill of people, regardless of ideology, to say that this way of life is important. And when all of a sudden you have one party deciding that power is more important than that goodwill and of our way of life, of having a voice, of being able to have a vote regardless of who you are, the color of your skin, your sex, we are in a very, very bad danger zone. Now, can we recover? Yes, we can recover. We have to find a way to have those voting rights acts, the John Lewis Act and the Freedom to Vote Act, passed out of the Senate and out of the House of Representatives. But we also have to have people of goodwill all across America say that our way of life is more important than any of our ideology. And so democracy to me is the number one issue in our land. And what can we do in terms of educators? One of the things we can do is make sure there's space, age-appropriate way, but make sure there's space in our curriculum so that kids actually have agency, so that kids know what civics means, not just to have like a pledge allegiance to the flag, but to understand what that means. And that also requires looking at the good and the bad of American history, including slavery and its effects, not hide it, not hide what happened on January 6th, and not lie about what happened in the last election.
Randi, you and I have talked in the past about reforms that teachers need to do. That you created Share Our Lessons, I think, or Share My Lesson plan to help teachers understand and kind of revitalize what they're doing. You've talked a bit about standards. From a lot of criticism of the American Federation of Teachers, the teachers out there, is that it's a stagnant pool. I'm just interested, in how you and I have seen this, you and I have talked about this, but I'd love our viewers to hear how, particularly during a pandemic, things have become more dynamic, more nimble. Tell us how you've changed that social contract in teaching between teachers and students and the role they play in society.
Thank you, Steve. So, most of the time, and I'm not saying we're not perfect. Banks are not perfect. Politicians are not perfect. Lawyers are not perfect. Accountants are not perfect. We who represent teachers, we're not perfect. But what has happened is that this idea that teachers joining together to actually make things better is so worrisome to right-wing and to people who have power, like hedge funders and whatever, it's worrisome that people are worried that teachers or paraprofessionals or other workers want to get a little piece more of the American dream. So that's why we get slammed by Fox every other minute, because, just like in the last 40, 50 years, why the Chamber of Commerce slammed, unions, because it's a way of equalizing the American dream and creating more of a middle class for workers. Having said that, what we've tried to do in the last couple of years is think about it. Right after the pandemic, all of a sudden teachers had huge autonomy because it was going from in-school learning to doing remote. And we had to basically develop our own platforms. We had to kind of MacGyver as much as we could. We had never been in a situation like that. And you used to hear parents say, "Oh my God, look at what teachers do." They had a front row seat in what teachers are doing and paras are doing. So this is what we tried to do to help. One, and a lot of people heard this, is that we tried to actually reopen schools more quickly than almost anybody else. We know in-person learning is really important. I sat on the Cuomo Commission. We put a report out in April of 2020 about the steps to reopen schools and how safety was a vehicle to reopen schools. You see how that then gets manipulated in terms of when we say we need to have masks or we need to have physical distancing or good ventilation. Those are ways in, not ways to stop. So that was number one. But number two, in terms of curriculum issues, we started thinking about, well, how do we sum up the 1920 school year? Let's kind of come up with capstone projects. There was no state test. Let's do that. And then we came up with them and put them on our website. Number three, we revamped the whole Share My Lesson website, made it available to everybody, not just for members. And anyone who's watching, just go to the website. We just did a whole new revamping of all of it. We made it more accessible to everybody. We made it quicker to get to what you want by 1 or 2 clicks instead of 10 clicks. And we put a lot of materials on for parents and for teachers and for kids about learning how to read, also social emotional learning. And those are the things we did, all at the union's cost. And what we've seen is that the number of people who have gone to Share My Lesson have gone up by a couple of 100,000 in the last year or so, because people see its worth and its value. So I think there's almost 1.9 million people that use the Share My Lesson website. But the other things we've done, as you know, turning around West Virginia rural school district,
McDowell County, West Virginia.
Yeah, McDowell. So the bottom line is this: we want every single public school to be a place where parents want to send their kids, where educators want to work, and where kids thrive. And thriving starts with making sure that kids have their mojo back, dealing with the emotional, social issues that have come up as, were there before, but come up in terms of the pandemic, and then also accelerating instruction. So if we can do that and create a welcoming and safe environment, and frankly, I've been since August 1st, 50 schools, 20 states. That's what educators are trying to do right now, even with all the shortages, even with all the protests, even with all of this stuff, eyes on the prize, how we help lift all kids.
Well, listen, I want to tell our audience something. The part of the reason that the Hill did this big 3-day super summit called A More Perfect Union is around a concept that Randi Weingarten and I worked out a few years ago. It's been around for a long time, called civitas. Civitas basically means there's a struggle. There's a struggle. It's not a kumbaya game to think about what the country needs, but you're all going to pull the same way in a sense you care about the country. That's why when we opened this with Senator Joe Manchin the other day, we had Michael Moore, the filmmaker, follow him with a lot of critique and a lot of difference. We actually talked about McDowell County. Today you heard John Bolton on just before Randi Weingarten, to show you can have a constructive conversation with people with very, very different perspectives and frames. And I just want to say a personal thanks to Randi Weingarten, because she helped me conceive the notion of civitas and what civic engagement means, and also figuring out how you can agree to disagree in a country like this. So Randi Weingarten, President of the American Federation of Teachers, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you for doing what you do. You're incredible.